the question I want to ask about the coastal commons, I want to locate it within the context where India is today, in terms of the direction of the economy, the attitude towards natural resources of both government and the private sector. Um, so whereas in the struggles in the 80s, there was a different context because there was still some at least acceptance. In today's India, there seems to be little acceptance even of the concept that there is something that is a common property resource. So in your struggle, which you've conducted over so many decades now, what do you feel is needs to be done to make, to make an impact on policy?
Our experience has been that finally it is the mobilization of the people who are involved, who are either affected or who are potentially affected by the loss of commons. That plays a huge role in India because with all its flaws, we still kind of a democracy, and if voices are raised sufficiently, there is always some attention. So there is no shortcut but to mobilize. Then, having said that, mobilization alone is not enough, and that is where academics, researchers, intellectuals play a very important role in helping present the position, articulate the particular views, which can then get acceptance at the level of policy making. So there is this need for people who are affected to come together and organize and demand. Unless they ask, they are not going to be given. And the other is to support it with the intellectual effort, which helps the community also articulates its demand better and not necessarily in a very short-term oriented manner, and also to provide the decision makers with a kind of a logic and this thing that they can accept.
But in the say if you take a 2-decade period, do you see any major victories of this kind where you manage to mobilize and get this kind of intellectual support and get commensurate change in policy?
Definitely. In the marine fisheries sector, for instance, 1980, 79-80, this was when the fishing communities, traditional fishing communities across India came together for the first time. 80 was the first time when there was a national level mobilization of traditional fishermen. Otherwise it has been sporadic and local. That is when the government of India was forced to recognize that there is a serious problem created by the introduction of modern mechanization, that it is not reaching the vast majority and it is not possible, and the small scale fishermen need protection. This resulted in the model bill which was circulated to all states, and that is the origin of the Marine Fishing Regulation Acts in all the state governments. So that is one.
And these are state laws, are they?
These are state laws because up to 12 nautical miles it is the jurisdiction of the state government. Then in 94, the government had introduced, Government of India, kind of foreign vessels in the deep sea. And there were many issues related to that, and the fact that the Indian fishermen would not benefit from that resulted in once again a national mobilization which brought together various actors, including both the mechanized and the small fishermen, exporters and fishermen. So businesses, everybody got together. There was a certain amount of intellectual support to that, and that resulted literally in a rollback of that policy in 94. So these are two clear. Then the latest big achievement was the coastal regulations. When the coastal regulation zone CRZ notification was proposed to be dropped and replaced by coastal management zone CMZ, I think the nationwide mobilization and continuous struggle for almost 2 years resulted in the Government of India dropping that proposal and going back to a process of trying to retain CRZ but modify it to suit the needs. So these are three clear examples where we have achieved something through mobilization.
So now, with the other commons, we keep hearing this thing about how the problem is not just government regulation and government control and management of these resources, but increasingly the collusion between the state and private interests to deplete access to these common resources for ordinary people. So in terms of coastal areas, what do you see now in today's, even though these regulations are there, what are the sort of threats that coastal communities and coastal resources
I'd like to
face?
take
Maybe
that.
Well, actually, since the past 2 decades, there's been since '91 especially, uh, there have been a lot of new entrants to the coast, and these have been in the form of larger sectors like the port development sector,
the what development?
the minor port development sector. There have been so definitely industrial sectors there are like tourism, port development sector, the shipping sector. A lot of proposals for power plants. The energy demands require also, these interests to now move towards the coast. So there is a lot of interest now and a lot of demand and claims being staked on coastal land areas, and this definitely has placed a tremendous kind of pressure on lands. And maybe 2 decades ago, in 91, from 81, when Mrs. Indira Gandhi, noticed or took attention and brought attention to the fact that these areas must be left as pristine. Now that sort of legacy or of that notification itself, we began to see from 91. It got weakened progressively to accommodate all these newer interests. In addition to private interests, I would say, like collusion with the state, as you were mentioning, there are many other interest groups who have their own objectives and their own understanding of how coastal areas should be managed. And in this group, I would include also people who are, say, interested in the business of conservation itself. People who would like to protect biodiversity. And these are agencies at various scales, at international, national, local. And
Why do you say you see them as
I see them as an interest group because, as a group that has a specific agenda, has a separate interest,
Yeah.
mainly articulated as the conservation of biodiversity. But you could categorize them as an interest group by means of their approach to this subject, by their reliance on specific systems of knowledge to justify why they have these objectives. So
So are you saying that this is like akin to the whole move to block of forests for tigers? So similarly, block of coastal areas to preserve biodiversity and therefore keep access of people out of it? Is that what you're trying to say?
there's definitely a parallel because most of these agencies are also engaged in terrestrial systems and in these sort of objectives. I'm not trying to villainize these agencies. What I'm saying is that they are most definitely an interest group to contend with, that the fishing community, that coastal communities who access these resources have to contend with. Because they are a very strong influence on how these areas are managed. And we see it, I suppose, like this is best illustrated in the form of marine protected areas. And quite recently, I think.
Just give me one example as a sort of illustration.
Well,
One part where.
probably one area where there are quite a few areas actually, but one would be the Gahirmatha Marine Sanctuary off the Orissa coast,
Yeah.
which is a very large 1,400 square kilometer area. It's also the site of the olive ridley sea turtle, a very globally endangered population of the olive ridley sea turtle. So it's a very large area that's cut off to access. Now, behind something like this marine protected area is what you see is the state has assumed that it has powers. According to Indian law, the territorial waters are within the control of the state, whereas there's actually probably a dichotomy there in terms of how citizens of that area, how the communities perceive those resources, because they probably have they do have unwritten stakes in those waters, and they definitely feel a sense of ownership over these spaces. So primarily by assuming, so there's no question of settling of rights, unlike in forest spaces. This is already supposed to be within the control of the central government, territorial waters. So this is it's a stark illustration of conflicts where you're just cutting off access.
So the local people, like the fisher folk there, feel resentful that this area has been cordoned off.
Yes, they do, because they're restricted from entering these areas
For fishing.
for
They can't.
fishing.
Yeah.
And the way these laws are designed are they don't take into understanding. Forget the complexity of the fishing community, but even the most simple kind of demographics about the area, how people access it, who's actually or even scientific information. In many cases, this whole conservation design is really bereft of that. So this is a very stark example, but I think another subtle example would be the shark ban case that Vivek could illustrate a little bit.
Around 2000, all of a sudden, like a bolt from the blue came the ban on shark fishing.
When was it?
Around 2000, I think.
Okay.
And it was just based on anecdotal information by some divers saying that, there used to be a lot of shark here and it's no more there. There was at that point from the scientific community, the research institution dealing with these things and the data related to shark, and did not reflect any particular problem. This is not to say that there may not have been a problem, but there was no background, and then suddenly they decided to ban. And this was a group of environmentalists who thought on those bases and then had put influence on the MOEF, Environment and Forest Ministry, that they just arbitrarily, without any consultation, without any proper process, just banned. Then of course typically mobilization took place. We went there, and they had a face-saving solution of banning some 6 or 7 species rather than shark as a whole, which makes it even more difficult to monitor, and it's more to save their face that they did it. Can I go back to your original question of this private thing? You see, in the fisheries sector, the fishing itself, the conflicts are substantially between groups of fishermen, or who are richer or who are owners of bigger boats and small boats and so on. There the entry of private capital and corporate interests is somewhat limited. It keeps coming in waves in the so-called deep sea.
Yeah.
But today, the state-private nexus is very sharp and very well pronounced in the coastal strip. Now, for instance, one of the state governments of Gujarat, for instance, formed the Gujarat Maritime Board. It looks like their main role has been to take over large tracts of coastal land and then sell it to the private business for all the SEZs, for the ports. So this is a clear case where state is setting up an agency and designating it to completely take over the coastal commons and then sell it. And sell it at a throwaway price that the same SEZ guys, having got it, the promoters, then resell it to individual industry at 10, 100 times even. So this is one classic. And worryingly, this model may probably spread. Now I realize that 3-4 other states have also started forming maritime boards. So
which are these states?
I think Tamil Nadu has, but I won't know what are their objectives, but I'm just speculating that the Gujarat example can spread. The latest one is Tamil Nadu. I think 2 or 3 other states, I don't recall, I think at least 4 states now have maritime boards whose job is possibly or most likely to just alienate common property on the coast.
But when you say they take over coastal lands, I presume it will be behind the CRZ area. It can't be the CRZ, correct?
It's a CRZ.
They can take over CRZ also.
You see, CRZ only regulates activities.
Yeah.
It doesn't bother about ownership.
Ownership.
It has got nothing to do with. You may own a patch of land which has mangrove. It only means that you can't, if you are cutting it, you are doing an illegal activity. Or if you are trying to build an industry, it is illegal. So, but there are permissible activities. So the CRZ has already been diluted. There are many permissible activities within the CRZ.
Ports, by nature of their activity, require the foreshore and the waterfront. I mean, they're one of those activities that the CRZ notification initially recognized as something that needs the coast.
Yeah.
But and the CRZ was initially meant only to really allow those things that absolutely need the coast, which is not the case anymore after 25 amendments, and now we have a newer notification which actually probably legitimizes many of those amendments. But there is, as Vivek was saying, these maritime boards are being constituted in each state, and they're seen as facilitators of greater port development in many sites, in sites such as Orissa. So we also don't know what our objectives really for the coast are. So you have 3 mass nesting sites, let's say, and there's now recently a move to declare the other 2 also as marine sanctuaries. There's some talk about that. At the same time, these ports, Orissa has, I think, proposals for about 14 to 15 ports, and most of these are located at river mouths, and there's most definitely a port at each mass nesting site. So in terms of how the state wants to prioritize what is the vision for the coast, for people, for biodiversity, for industry, there's conflict. On the whole, there's confusion.
But this port, the Orissa port situation also illustrates another interesting pattern in which involves the state as well as the environmental groups. If it's a conflict between environment and poor people like fishing community disappears. If it is a conflict between the big industry and environment, environmental priorities are often very lower. So they get the red carpet. So whether it's the Tatas in Dhamra or somebody, then it's a different story. If it's poor fishermen, 7 months they need not fish, or 5 months they are banned from fishing, and so on. So the clear hierarchy. Livelihoods is the lowest, environment is the next important, big industry is the most important. This is how the whole system at the moment is working. So, yeah.
What is your view on the Jairam Ramesh's latest thing of modifying the CRZ for Bombay? I mean, he'll do it probably for other coastal cities. But his whole argument that you can't be absolutist on the CRZ, and that you have to.
Yeah, I think that is a very dangerous position that he has taken because the logic that is coming, it was also the original logic of the Swaminathan committee, the first committee, which proposed the CMZ, that there is so much diversity on the coast and variation that single law cannot capture. It may sound very good, it may sound very logical, but the reality is the CRZ is flexible and can be made even more flexible. We need a rule within the CR. It's a rule-based system applicable nationally. The whole zonation itself gives you the flexibility. We are already saying that all areas are not the same. So we need, if there are certain problems that are arising which are not accommodated in the present zone, it has to be reformulated as a law which is still applicable across the nation. For one reason you give Bombay an exemption, for totally different reason you give Goa some other exemption. What is to prevent tomorrow in the coalition politics that Tamil Nadu is going to ask, Andhra Pradesh is going to ask. So, maybe coastal Andhra guys may let go Hyderabad if you allow some serious CRZ violations. I'm just giving us a, not a very serious example. But,
but you're
so,
right,
you open the door saying that, in the name of diversity, you will give, without any rule, without any clear-cut norm, concessions. So it completely undermines the principles of the national law. And in the specific case of Bombay, if you are interested in the particular issue, see, basically there are 2 categories of people requiring construction on the coast. And how this concession is being made needs to be understood. One is the slums. Now, there may be good reasons or legal reasons why the slums have to be rehabilitated where they are. But it is a very serious societal issue that an island city like Bombay, vulnerable to all the natural calamities, sea level rise, etc., why should it go on a building spree within 500 meters? Within 500 meters from the shore. And is this we have nothing against slums, rehabilitation, we see them as the most vulnerable route in needs proper support from the state, but is it really that they should be rehabilitated only within 500 meters from the sea? Fishermen have no option. It is a risk that they have to take. Why should all the others be put in the same list? First category, first problem. Second issue, okay, so be it. Then let's say 100,000, what is the number of people to be rehabilitated, so many flats. The model of rehabilitation is builders have to build and give free flats to these people and then make up money by building a double the number of flats which they sell. So you are quite, the first part is okay, the slums about,
When
now
you
I
said
talk.
fishermen had no option, yeah.
So once the slums, the second issue about the whole slum rehabilitation is the model of rehabilitation where private builders without state investment build, give free flats to the recognized slum dwellers and then probably build an equal number of additional flats making use of relaxation in floor space index and sell. So you are going to double the amount of construction and double the amount of population in those areas. So it's extremely, risky and, bad for the environment, bad for themselves. And the Swaminathan committee, the second one, said, why don't you consider public finance? Because this FSI concession is given so that the fellow can build more and sell and get the incentive. But they have come up with a very funny compromise saying state government will put 51% investment, 49 will be private builder. But the floor space index concession will still be there. So, it's completely, illogical what they have done. The logic given, of course, is that if there is state funds, there will be greater accountability. That is what they are arguing. But the problem of coastal conservation is gone. Risking so many people's lives is, foolhardy. And, what's going to be left of the Bombay coast? 120 large slum development programs.
Yeah.
So, incredible. The other group, of course, is the dilapidated buildings, old buildings.
Yeah.
They have the same problem. No flat owner in Bombay probably ever renovates his building without builder support.
Yeah.
There also they need the FSI. So, which means we are allowing Bombay coast to be just built up. And it's completely counterproductive. So, to say that Bombay, if you say Bombay needs differential treatment, some of us are saying it should be more stringent because Bombay is more vulnerable than any other coastal cities being surrounded by water. It's an island city, literally, and it has to be more responsible in its development.
Okay, so just from the point of view of the conference particularly, if you think there are any synergies that have emerged from this particular conference or that you can see which will play a significant role in the future?
From a purely Indian point of view,
Yeah.
it's very clear that, the various, groups working on different commons, the forests commons, water, pastoralism, fisheries, coast. There has been a meeting of all these people. And suddenly, in many people's mind, you can see suddenly, you can see the light popping, Why? It's the same problem we have. So it looks as if suddenly, at least at the level of intellectuals working on these issues, this conference is providing for the Indian groups clear evidence that there is a lot more in common between all these commons and there is a need to work together. And it's not necessarily at reaching any concrete proposals of that kind, but very clearly there is a mental click in the mind. In the fisheries group, yesterday we organized a special meeting. And for a day which was either a break or to take a field trip, 30-40 people turned up, and across sectors. And there is even a formal, not exactly formal, there's an informal understanding of continuing the discussion and to find how we can work together. I think that's a synergy.
And since we're on this, how would you think a conference like this can feed into or strengthen ground movements, resistance movements or struggles that are going on the ground?
2-3 ways. One, people who are connected with those movements have been facilitated to come here. That's very important. I think that's what the FES needs to be especially complimented, because they've understood this and facilitated those of us who are connected with movements and actual movement leaders also. In the case of the fishing community, the movement leaders came here. So that itself giving them a platform to and giving them an opportunity to link. So they make the linkages. That's one model, and it's probably happened here. The other probably would be the, some kind of follow-up in terms of, many things have come up. How do we then, bring together some of these actors and somewhere continue the dialogue, to feed into policy. So I think both are possible and both are methods that can work.
Aarti, would you like to respond to the same question?
Yeah, to the second thing, I want to add that the fact that FES, being a practitioner organization, has emphasized the Commons initiative more than, the conference is a great idea, but it's important. I think practitioners will recognize that there has to be a head and a tail to most of these things, and the Commons initiative, which is supported many groups, not just the fisheries group, but other groups as well, to use this conference and the opportunity of all these people coming to highlight these issues. But as Vivek was saying, we also need to, since we've now had this first conference on commons, there are lots of similarities across different sectors, fields, areas, resources, but we would need to deliberate on how we can actually concretely take this forward, support the different groups to complete some of the tasks that they've undertaken, whether it's documenting different kinds of commons management, whether it's supporting different campaigns to highlight the importance of commons within policy making. So these are all, each of these groups has a lot of things that they've prioritized in the immediate, maybe next couple of years. These things need to be supported, and if as part of the Commons initiative, if that can be worked on, that would be a great way to kind of culminate what FES has started.
And like I was asking before, if you could speak about any positive examples or success stories of how commons have been managed by communities or commons management, that would be also very nice.
See, there's not too much documented information from the country, but one of the publications that associated with this conference, which is called Common Voices, it features a couple of examples, and I'd actually ask Vivek to elaborate a little bit. One is an example from Kerala, the other is an initiative that he's been very closely associated with from Tamil Nadu. There are these and there are several other instances, but Vivek would be in the best position to.
Yeah, but is your question related to the coastal commons in particular? Okay. Yes. There are these traditional institutions across the coast. What is probably not recognized is that there are about 3,000 coastal villages, fishing villages. All of them are self-governed up to a point. There are traditional institutions which take collective decisions on the use of the coastal space, the use of the beach space, and the kind of fishing operations and the regulation over them. Till even today, at the moment, almost all these villages, it is a village committee which still decide when they can go fishing and not go fishing, which are holidays for fishing. And we find, at least in many parts of the coastal space is also managed by these people for their social objectives. So for instance, post-tsunami, we found that the village community was able to get the members, the individual families, to, let's say, relocate in larger interest, so that proper planning could take place, that the funding that was coming for good, safe, a village could be properly utilized. So there has been a very active, engagement of the village committees, traditional village committees, with their members to decide on many of these things. So there is a great amount of governance actually going on the coast. There is a great governance capacity there. But the problem is one of lack of recognition. They have not been recognized. And therefore, these local community institutions and the state operations may be often working at cross purposes, which means that, each nullifies the other, or, it doesn't really help. So there is a system of governance out there which actively manages the coastal resources, but it doesn't get the kind of support, I think. And also, the limitation of these village kind of governance systems is they can only manage their immediate resource. And many of the externalities coming from other things, they have no control. Often you may have, at least fishing wise, two coastal villages undermining each other because they have totally different policies in fishing. So that is also there. It's not just the state and this thing. So there's a need to bring, recognize the capacity there, strengthen that, and to bring it in a meaningful framework that we get overall effective resource management.
And specifically, the examples is what is covered in this larger. I mean, you're talking about generally the system of management of common coastal areas.
Coastal areas.
So there's a need to strengthen the village communities and their own systems of governing these spaces. Right. And there was also something about, I wouldn't know how to frame this question on the demographics of the fishing community well. But if you could just elaborate on, like you said, there are lots of different coastal communities. So if you could just elaborate a little bit on the demographics of the fishing community and what kind of diversity is there.
See, marine fishing is a very old occupation, one of the oldest. Some communities are, at least 2000 years old in terms of continuity. And typically, traditional occupations like fishing in India is done by castes. So we have a number of exclusive marine fishing castes on the coast. Of course, it's not that only marine fishing castes exclusively are catching fish everywhere, but by and large, this is the dominant paradigm. And these 3,200 odd fishing villages, most of them are based on castes of fishermen who are historically involved in marine fishing and who have their own self-governance system. And they live by and large in splendid isolation of their own. They are more bothered about their sea, their immediate coastal space, and their own livelihoods, and maintain their own culture. They link to a limited extent to the mainstream Panchayat Raj institutions, the state government, district administration, and all. They do interact and all that, but they still retain a fair amount of autonomy, almost like tribes. So this is a very special characteristic, and it has got its own potential in the sense that they have a cohesion and they have a collective, despite various problems associated with it as a result of class formation due to mechanization and various the politicization. All that is there, but overall, it is still remarkably a system that is functioning more than 60 years after independence.
And I'm going to go back to some very basic questions, if you could just lay them out, because one of the things we're also hoping to use these interviews for is pushing policy agendas and making more people aware of what is the kind of debate that is going on within this commons in the academic and in the intellectual field. So if you could just lay out some of the key challenges that coastal commons in particular and management of those faces in today, that would be also very significant for us.
We'd mentioned this before as well. What we've seen over the past, say even a dramatically big change over the past 1 or 2 decades, is the change in terms of the pressures on the coast. So while there is the problem of not knowing too much about who exists on the coast, what are ownership patterns, what are community management systems, governance institutions, these are the serious information gaps that we have, as a result of which many of our policy decisions are really they find that these are big gaps. But aside from this, there is the overall environment of a very strong pressure on the coasts from non-coastal interests. Basically from specifically non-fisher and non-coastal kind of industries and sectors that are entering the coast. So there's a very great pressure on that particular space. And coupled with the fact that, what we are discussing here is local communities and their interests in these spaces as groups that rely on them for their for their livelihoods, but also who have certain kinds of governance patterns and manage these social ecological systems. So what we see is a lot of outside interests coming there, and the pressure is over land. The pressure is in a context where there is poor documentation of what these communities' stakes are, how they access these resources, their dependence on it, we find that a lot of these are being frittered away. These rights are not recognized, but also any access to these resources is now dwindling. So the greatest thing is really the pressure on land, and I suppose you could prioritize it in terms of a few sectors that are more prominent that we hear about, which is the port sector, the commercial ports, the big commercial ports, and these are the newer problems rather than in addition to things like marine pollution and city-based pollution, but port sector, there is the thermal power sector. Lots of proposals for thermal power plants, nuclear power plants on the coast. It was also mentioned, I mean, we've seen that legislation has been changed also to accommodate industries and to accommodate special economic zones on the coast, although the new legislation rolls back on that. But these are things that have been allowed an entrance into the coast, so, and they find it lucrative to want to stay there.